In 1978, a Jewish photographer walked into a cathedral in Turin, Italy, expecting to debunk the most famous relic in Christianity, and his name was Barry Schwartz. He was not there to believe anything. He was there to prove it was fake, and within 1 hour, that plan began to fall apart. He was born in Pittsburgh and raised in a strict Orthodox Jewish household where everything followed rules, with 2 sets of dishes, 2 sets of silverware, and grandparents living in the same house. He had his bar mitzvah at 13 and grew up inside a system built on discipline and tradition. But by adulthood, he had walked away from all of it and had not thought about God in years. He had no interest in Jesus Christ, no interest in the resurrection, and no reason to care about any Christian relic. That distance was exactly why he was chosen, because if something was wrong, he would see it. He was one of the most respected scientific photographers in the United States, trained to document reality without interpretation and without emotion. No agenda, no belief, just data. When a team of 33 scientists gathered to examine the Shroud of Turin, a linen cloth about 4.36 meters long that millions believe wrapped the body of Jesus, after crucifixion, they needed someone exactly like him, someone who would not bend the result, someone who would not look away. Schwartz tried to quit twice before the work even began because he told the team leader it made no sense for him to be there. A Jewish man had no reason to study Christianity's most important relic. His logic was clear, and it should have been enough. That was when a NASA imaging scientist named Don Lin said something that changed the direction of everything. He reminded Schwartz that the man on that cloth was also Jewish. Then he added 5 words that would follow him for the next 46 years. God does not tell us in advance. Schwartz arrived in Turin expecting something simple and predictable because he thought he would find paintbrush strokes or at least some sign of fabrication. He believed this would be a technical job, something clean and easy to close. He expected a clear answer. Within the first hour, that expectation collapsed because the image did not behave like paint at all. It was not sitting on the surface like pigment, and it was not absorbed into the threads like dye. Under magnification, the color appeared only on the outermost fibers of the linen. Later measurements showed that layer was about 200 nanometers thick, thinner than a bacterium, and far too shallow for any known artistic method. There were no brush strokes and no direction of movement, and there was no sign of liquid spreading through the cloth. The image was there, but it was not applied in any normal way. At that point, something was already wrong, but it was not enough to change his mind. Because there was one detail that did not just look unusual, it completely broke the rules. And that detail would hold him in place for 17 years. The blood was red, not brown, not black, not aged in any way that made sense. It looked fresh, and that should not have been possible. Standing over the cloth in 1978, Schwartz looked at his colleague Vern Miller, and both of them understood immediately that something was off. Dried blood does not stay red. It cannot. Hemoglobin breaks down quickly after exposure to air, and within hours the color begins to darken, shifting to brown, and eventually to black over time. This is basic forensic chemistry, and it is not debated. There are no known natural conditions where blood remains visibly red for centuries. None. And yet that is exactly what they were looking at, and that single detail was enough to override everything else because it did not matter how strange the image was or how precise it appeared. If that one fact was wrong, then everything was wrong. So Schwartz held on to that contradiction, and he refused to move past it for 17 years, even as more data began to accumulate around him. He kept documenting, he kept observing, but he did not accept, because one unanswered question is enough to stop everything. What he did not know at the time was that the answer already existed, and when it finally reached him, it would not come from belief or interpretation. It would come from chemistry, from a single molecule that changes how blood behaves under extreme conditions. That moment is coming, but not yet. Because the story of the shroud does not begin in 1978, and the first crack in the idea that this was a simple forgery happened decades earlier in 1898, inside the same cathedral in a dark room where a man nearly dropped what he saw. His name was Secondo Pia, and he had been given permission to photograph the cloth during a public exhibition. Photography at the time was slow and unforgiving, using large glass plates and chemical development with no preview, which meant you only saw the result after everything was done. That night, as Pia developed the plate in a dim, red-lit room, the image began to appear, and what he saw did not behave the way images are supposed to behave. Something was different from the start. In a photographic negative light becomes dark, and dark becomes light, and faces usually look distorted and unnatural. That is how the process works in every normal case. But this was not normal. The negative revealed a clear human face with correct proportions, visible injuries, and an expression that looked disturbingly real, and it appeared more natural than the cloth itself. It did not look reversed, it looked correct, which means the image on the cloth is already a negative, and that creates a problem no one has been able to solve. Because to create a negative image, you must understand how photographic inversion works, and that knowledge did not exist in the medieval world. There was also no way to test or verify such an image before cameras were invented, yet this cloth shows a perfect negative across an entire human body. That should not exist. That was the first crack. And for decades, no one could explain it clearly, because the image did not behave like any known form of art, and it did not behave like anything else either. It simply did not fit. And then in 1978, Schwartz stood over the same cloth and saw something that already defied known categories, yet one problem still held everything in place and refused to go away. Because no matter how strange the image was, no matter how precise it looked, the same contradiction remained at the center of everything. Old blood does not stay red. And until that problem was solved, nothing else mattered. For 17 years, Barry Schwartz held on to that single contradiction and refused to move past it, even as the evidence around him continued to grow, because for him the problem was simple and absolute. If one detail breaks the rules, then everything must be questioned, and no matter how unusual the image appeared or how consistent the data became, the red color of the blood remained unresolved and therefore unacceptable. During that time, the scientific investigation expanded through a group known as STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, where 33 scientists worked intensively in 1978 using X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet imaging, and microchemical testing to examine every measurable aspect of the cloth, and instead of confirming a forgery, the results removed the most obvious explanation because they found no pigments, no dyes, no paints, and no evidence of any material being applied to create the image. At the same time, chemists John Heller and Alan Adler focused specifically on the stains, because if the image was not paint, then the blood itself had to be tested directly, and their analysis confirmed the presence of hemoglobin serum albumin and porphyrin compounds, all of which are consistent with real human blood and not with any known artistic medium, which meant the stains were biological rather than symbolic. But that result only intensified the problem, because if the blood was real, then the color should have followed known chemical behavior, and instead it remained visibly red, which directly contradicted the expected oxidation process where hemoglobin breaks down over time and darkens, creating a conflict that could not be ignored or explained through normal conditions. Another detail made the situation even more difficult to explain. because the blood appeared before the image, and under the blood stains there is no discoloration of the fibers, which means the cloth received the blood first and the image formed afterward, reversing the sequence of any known artistic method, since an artist would always create the body first and then add blood as detail, not the other way around. At this point, multiple independent observations were already pointing in the same direction. The image was not paint, the blood was real, and the sequence did not match any known technique. Yet for Schwarz, none of that resolved the central contradiction, because the color still did not make sense, and until that was explained, he would not accept any conclusion. Years passed with that unresolved question remaining in place, and then in the mid-1990s, a phone call came from Alan Adler, who by that time was seriously ill and knew he did not have much time left, and during that call he explained that the answer was not in the image itself, but in the chemistry of the blood, specifically in a compound called bilirubin. Bilirubin is produced when red blood cells break down under extreme physical stress, and while it normally exists at low levels in the body, severe trauma can cause it to rise dramatically, especially in conditions associated with shock. And when bilirubin combines with hemoglobin, it alters how the blood behaves by stabilizing its red color and slowing the oxidation process that would normally cause it to darken over time. This was not speculation, but a measurable chemical effect, and it provided a direct explanation for the one detail that had remained unresolved for 17 years, because the presence of unusually high bilirubin levels could allow the blood to retain its red appearance far longer than expected under normal conditions. Adler connected this chemical explanation to the physical evidence on the cloth, because the image showed a body that had experienced extreme trauma with more than 100 wound marks across the back and shoulders, consistent with Roman flagellation, where a whip embedded with metal or bone fragments would strike repeatedly, causing severe injury and blood loss, and these injuries were not random, but followed patterns that matched historical descriptions. The image also showed wounds consistent with crucifixion, including nail placement through the wrists, rather than the palms, which aligns with modern biomechanical studies, demonstrating that the palms cannot support the weight of a human body, and another detail reinforced the anatomical accuracy because the thumbs were not visible, which corresponds with damage to the median nerve, causing the thumb to contract inward. A physiological response not understood in medieval times, but accurately reflected in the image. All of these observations pointed to a body that had undergone extreme physical stress before death, and now the chemistry of the blood matched that condition because elevated bilirubin levels are consistent with severe trauma and shock, creating a direct link between the biological evidence and the physical appearance of the stains. For Schwarz, this was the turning point because the single contradiction he had relied on for 17 years was no longer a contradiction. It had a consistent explanation grounded in chemistry and supported by the condition of the body shown on the cloth, and once that barrier was removed, the rest of the evidence could no longer be dismissed in the same way. This did not prove a final conclusion, but it changed the structure of the problem because the question was no longer whether the shroud was unusual, but how many independent lines of evidence could align before the original assumption stopped making sense. And with that shift, the investigation moved into a new phase where the focus was no longer on individual anomalies, but on how they all connected. And once that process began, the next discoveries would push the shroud even further beyond anything that could be explained by conventional methods. Once that barrier was removed, the investigation did not slow down, but accelerated, because when the blood was no longer a contradiction, every other anomaly began to matter more, and the focus shifted from questioning individual details to understanding how so many independent findings could exist together without collapsing into a single explanation. In 1976, two researchers, John Jackson and Eric Jumper, analyzed photographs of the shroud using a device called the VP8 image analyzer, which had been designed for NASA to convert brightness into three-dimensional information, and while this system normally produces distorted results when applied to standard images, the output in this case formed a coherent three-dimensional structure with correct facial depth and proportional alignment. The face showed natural contours. The nose projected outward correctly, and the eye sockets appeared recessed in a way that matched real anatomy, and the intensity of the image correlated directly with distance between the cloth and the body, which is not how paintings or photographs behave, because in normal images, brightness does not encode consistent spatial depth across an entire surface. This result introduced a new problem, because the shroud was no longer just an image, but a source of encoded spatial data, and repeated attempts to reproduce this effect using painting bas-relief models or heat-based techniques failed to create the same consistent three-dimensional mapping, which meant the mechanism behind the image remained unidentified. As this layer of evidence was added, another line of investigation focused on microscopic particles embedded within the cloth, including pollen grains, which were analyzed by Max Frey, and his findings showed that many of these pollen types originated from regions outside Europe, particularly the Middle East, suggesting that the cloth had not remained in a single location but had traveled across multiple environments over time. When these botanical findings were compared with historical records, a possible path began to emerge, starting in Jerusalem, moving through Edessa and Constantinople, and eventually reaching Europe. And while the historical documentation is not continuous, the alignment between the pollen evidence and recorded references created a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. At the same time, another piece of evidence appeared in Spain, where a separate relic known as the Sudarium of Oviedo showed blood patterns that closely matched those on the shroud, including similar stain shapes and the identification of the same AB blood type. And although this does not prove both cloths belonged to the same individual, it significantly reduces the likelihood that such similarities occurred independently. Further forensic analysis continued to reveal details that aligned with known Roman execution practices, including patterns of scourging consistent with flagellation and wound placement consistent with crucifixion through the wrists rather than the palms, which matches modern biomechanical studies, showing that the palms cannot support the weight of a human body under those conditions. Another anatomical detail reinforced this pattern because the thumbs are not visible in the image, which corresponds with damage to the median nerve, causing involuntary contraction of the thumb inward, a physiological response not understood in medieval times, but accurately reflected on the cloth, adding another layer of precision that would be difficult to fabricate without advanced knowledge. As these findings accumulated, the evidence appeared to move in a consistent direction, but in 1988, radiocarbon dating introduced a major challenge because tests conducted by 3 laboratories placed the origin of the cloth between 1260 and 1390, which aligned with the medieval forgery hypothesis and was widely accepted as a definitive conclusion at the time. However, that conclusion did not remain stable because later textile analysis revealed that the sample used for testing had been taken from a corner of the cloth that showed signs of repair following a fire in 1532, and this repaired section contained a mixture of older and newer fibers, which means the dating result may have reflected the repair rather than the original fabric. Further statistical examination of the radiocarbon data revealed inconsistencies between laboratories that exceeded expected variation, raising additional questions about the reliability of the result, and as newer analytical methods were applied, including studies of cellulose degradation and chemical aging patterns. Some findings suggested an origin closer to the 1st century. None of these later tests provide absolute certainty on their own, but when combined with the other evidence, they form a pattern that does not align cleanly with the idea of a simple medieval creation, and as more data emerged from different scientific fields, the explanation became increasingly difficult to reduce to a single cause. For Schwartz, this accumulation marked a shift in how the problem was understood because it was no longer about resolving one contradiction, but about recognizing convergence, where independent lines of evidence from chemistry, physics, forensic science, and historical analysis all pointed in the same general direction without cancelling each other out. And that convergence created a new kind of tension, because even if each piece of evidence could be debated individually, the combined weight made the original explanation less stable, forcing the question to move beyond whether the shroud was unusual and towards something more difficult to answer. Because at this point, one question remained, and it was no longer about the blood, the history, or the image structure, but about the mechanism itself, since everything observed suggested that the image had been formed by a process that has not yet been fully identified or reproduced. By the time all of these layers were examined together, the question had already changed, because the issue was no longer whether the shroud was unusual, but whether any known process could account for everything observed at the same time, since the image was not paint. The blood was real, the sequence of formation did not match any artistic method, and the structure of the image contained three-dimensional information, meaning each piece alone was difficult to explain, but taken together they created something that resisted every simple answer. Scientists began focusing on the final problem, which was not what the image showed, but how it was formed, because whatever created it had to meet very strict conditions. It had to affect only the outermost fibers of the linen without penetrating deeper. It had to encode distance information across the entire body, and it had to avoid any directional pattern that would suggest movement or contact. And when these requirements were compared with known chemical and physical processes, none of them matched completely. The image is not the result of heat because there is no thermal gradient or burn pattern in the fibers, and it is not the result of any known radiation process because there is no damage consistent with energy transfer at that scale, and experiments using lasers, ultraviolet light, and other controlled energy sources have only managed to reproduce small sections under very specific conditions without ever scaling to a full human image with consistent properties. One estimate suggested that producing such an image through radiation would require an energy release on the order of trillions of watts in a fraction of a second, which is far beyond what any natural biological process can generate and far beyond anything available to medieval technology. And while that estimate does not explain how the image was created, it defines the level of precision and intensity required, leaving the mechanism itself unresolved. At the same time, the geometry of the image introduces another constraint because there is no distortion that would normally appear if the cloth had been wrapped tightly around a three-dimensional body, meaning the image behaves as if it was formed at a distance rather than through direct contact, and if it is distance-based, then something encoded spatial information without pressure which does not align with any known imprinting method. For decades, researchers have attempted to isolate a single explanation that could account for all of these features, with some proposing chemical reactions between the body and the cloth, others suggesting environmental effects such as heat or gas diffusion, and some exploring unknown forms of energy interaction. But each of these explanations solves part of the problem while failing to address the rest, which leaves the overall phenomenon incomplete. This does not prove any specific conclusion, but it establishes something more fundamental, which is that the current set of known processes is not sufficient to fully explain what is observed, and that statement is not about belief but about limitation, because the absence of a complete explanation does not confirm any theory, but does define the boundary of current understanding. For Barry Schwartz, this boundary became the turning point, because after decades of documentation and analysis, he did not arrive at his conclusion through faith, but through accumulation, he did not convert to Christianity, and he did not change his identity, but he accepted that the explanation he started with no longer fit the evidence he had seen. That position is not unique to him, because many researchers who have studied the shroud do not agree on what it is, but they do agree on what it is not. It is not a simple painting, it is not easily reproduced, and it does not fit cleanly into any existing category, which places it in a position that is difficult for both skeptics and believers to resolve. At the same time, there are still arguments against its authenticity, including the radiocarbon dating results, gaps in the historical record, and questions about interpretation, and these criticisms are part of the scientific process, but they do not eliminate the central issue, because even when one line of evidence is challenged, the others remain and continue to point in the same direction. This creates a situation where the shroud exists in an unresolved space, fully available for study and heavily analyzed, yet not fully explained, because it is not hidden and it is not inaccessible, but it resists closure in a way that is unusual for an object studied for over a century. And this leads to a final question that is more difficult than the one the story began with, because the original question was whether the shroud was real, but that question has already been replaced by something more complex, which is whether the limits of current knowledge are sufficient to explain it, or whether what we are looking at represents a case where observation has moved ahead of explanation. Because the shroud does not require belief to be examined, it only requires observation, and what has been observed is consistent enough to challenge simple explanations while remaining incomplete enough to prevent a final answer, which means it exists in a state that is neither confirmed nor dismissed but still open. And until a method is found that can reproduce every feature of the image under controlled conditions, that position is unlikely to change, because in science, explanation is not defined by what could happen, but by what can be repeated, and so far no one has been able to do that.